So let's start then. Now, ecology is obviously all to do with organisms and where they live. I know that a lot of you in year 11, you went through the first few slides we're going to be looking at then today, but just want to kind of go back to the start here a little bit then and talk about a bit about ecology then. Now, in this unit, you're going to have to learn lots of different definitions, some of which you will have heard of before, some ones you might not have heard of before. Start with one of the first ones in. The one is called population. You've heard about the population of the world, of course. And this population is quite specific. Okay, it's the number of organisms of the same species living in the same area. Okay, so again, in exams and in tests, you need to mention same species and also mention living in the same area. So that's population. So you could have a population of spiders in a forest. Could have a population of minnows in a pond. But must be the same species and it must be living in the same area. Now, leads on, of course, the habitat. The habitat is simply where something lives, whether it be a forest or the desert or a pond or even sometimes on a leaf. It just simply means where an organism lives. Okay. Also, we have community. Community is slightly different. Community is then a lots of different populations together. So, say it might be, for example, all the spiders and ladybirds and slugs and butterflies and beetles and everything else in a particular area then. So that's what we call community. As in a community center, and a place might have a community center where everybody gets together. Well, community is all of the different populations all in one particular area. Now, other ones we have, one it's quite difficult to understand sometimes is biodiversity. If we think of it somewhere maybe where there's very low biodiversity, somewhere like the desert, there aren't that many things which can live there. Okay, so again we have quite a low biodiversity. And then of course somewhere like the jungle, there's a very high biodiversity. You've got lots of different plants, lots of different animals, and therefore you have a high biodiversity. So it's a measure of the different species living in an area. It's not just the number of plants, because it could all be the same plant. Like in a farmer's field, for example, there's quite a low biodiversity because it's the same crop growing. Whereas it needs to be then lots of different plants and animals and lots of different organisms all living in the same area, and also a large number of them. So that's what we mean by biodiversity. The grey, of course, they're affected by the environment. That's things such as like the rainfall and also what else lives there. So again, we can kind of break it down into two different parts. We can break it down into the abiotic factors and the biotic factors. The abiotic, first of all, that's things which are not alive. Biology is the study of living things. So abiotic is something which is not alive then. So abiotic factors are things such as temperature, humidity, intensity, light intensity, all that kind of stuff would all be things. Those would all be abiotic factors then. Then of course we have the opposite, which is a biotic factor. This is a living factor. So things such as how many predators there are there, what prey there is to eat, those are all examples then of biotic factors then. So the environment's kind of a mixture then of the abiotic factors and also the biotic factors. So that's a few different definitions, and over the course of the next maybe 5-10 minutes, we'll learn more about then these different definitions then. Now, one of the things we couldn't actually do by sampling is where we try and get an idea as to how many plants and animals and other creatures there are in a particular area. Now, to do that, there's a couple of things we use. Now, if we're studying then plants, then what we'd use is we'd use things like this. We'd use quadrats. Now, quadrats is something then which you're going to see looks a bit like this here. So this here is a quadrat. Now, a quadrat then is something then which is lots of little squares. Now, quite often what we do is you would use a quadrat then which is 1 meter long and 1 meter high then. What we do then, say we wanted to find out how many weeds there were in a particular field, for example. What we might do then is we might then measure, first of all, how long a field is, measure how wide a field is. Then what we need to do then is we need to randomly take a sample then of weeds in this field then. So what we're doing in fact then is we've marked out then the actual then width of the field, we've marked out then the length of the field, and what we need to do is we need to have coordinates then, coordinates where we could actually go and put this quadrat device down then. Now to make sure we're not biased about the results, what we do is we do it then randomly then. So we need some way of working out then a random place then to put the quadrat down. What we can do is we can go to a calculator. We can type in the random number function on the calculator. We can use that then to work out coordinates. And then what we do is we can walk then to that part of the field. We can put the quadrat down. We can see how many weeds there are in that particular quadrat then. Might do that 25 times and therefore get 25 sets of results. What we can then do is we can then work out the average number of weeds per quadrat. So say we get an average of 6 weeds per quadrat. Then we do have to multiply them by the amount of times that quadrat would fit into the whole field. Now, the more results we take, then the more representative it is. Okay, but certainly it takes time, so we can't spend all day measuring results. So we need to give ourselves a bit of time. But the more results we can get, then the more representative the actual information is then. And that's how we kind of work out a quadrat. So work out the amount randomly put in the quadrats. You work out how much there is per quadrat, and then you multiply by the amount of times that quadrat would fit into the entire field then. Again, quadrats work well. If we want to maybe see how the distribution of plants changes, you use a thing called a belt transect. Now, belt transect is something like this. Quite often works well at a beach where we used to do it then, where you kind of look at the seaweed then in different parts of the beach. What you can do is you can kind of put a tape measure down, kind of from near the water's edge to up then towards the road really. What you do is you put the tape measure down, and then what you do is every few meters, then what you do is say it's every 5 meters, for example, put the quadrat down, you see then which seaweed you find in those different quadrats. Kind of shows a good distribution of how the plants are found then. So you might find, for example, a certain kind of seaweed lives closer to the water, and a certain kind of seaweed lives further away from the water then. So again, it kind of shows a good, if there's a trend, for example, the belt transect should pick it up then. So say we put the tape measure down, you put the quadrat down every 5 meters, for example, and you kind of see then how distribution changes slightly then. That's our belt transect. So let's, which you will have seen before, with these food chains then. Now food chains here again, there's different terms we need to remember in terms of food chains. First one is a nice easy one. It's producer. Okay, so there's my producer there. It of course can produce its own food then using sunlight. Now sunlight is a source of energy. Doesn't matter what kind of food chain it is, the sunlight is always a source of energy then. Now that plant, of course, the plant needs some energy then to respire. It's going to need some for growth. It's going to need some we lost as leaves and things fall off. So again, the actual plant needs then lots of energy. Only a small amount of that energy gets passed on then to the next stage then. Now, this next stage then is called then the second trophic level. I should just say then the plant then is a first trophic level. Trophic means feeding. So first trophic level, second trophic level, third trophic level. Okay, also called then tertiary trophic level, fourth trophic level, also called quaternary trophic level as well. And this then leads on when everything dies in the end, of course, to get broken down by decomposers. We'll come back to those later on. So we're saying that energy, of course, comes from the sun, is taken in by the plants, they make food, that food gets passed on to the next animal, it gets passed on to the next one, passed on to the next one. And when they all die, of course, they get broken down by these decomposers. Now, a question we ask in exams all the time is what does the arrow represent? Now, you can't simply say the flow of energy. It's kind of the easiest way to explain it. You can say things such as what eats what, and the mouse in this case eats the plants. But again, it's easier maybe just to say the flow of energy. So food chains. Now, if we go on, you're going to find we need to have some energy calculations in terms of food chains. So you might get something which looks a little bit like this in the exam as well here. If we think here, you need to look to see how energy is being lost here. So if we have a look here, maybe energy is coming in, there's 1,000 joules of energy coming in here. And what happens in fact then is that most of that energy then is simply either bouncing off the leaf. It could be, it might be passing through the leaf and not hitting the chloroplast in the leaf. So a lot of energy then is simply which is coming towards the sun is being wasted then. Now however, if then it takes in energy, okay, it's just taking in energy here, it's taking in, let's say for the sake of argument that it does take in fact then 1,000 joules of light energy. Now most of that light energy then is going to be wasted, it can't get passed on. So we're saying here 990 joules, most of it is being lost then to the environment in different ways, whether it be it's respiring, for example, or else it might be simply then producing seeds and the seeds being passed away, leaves fall off, all those kind of things are all been lost to the environment. So only a small amount, normally about 10% of the energy is getting passed on then to the next animal then. Only 10 joules getting passed on here. Now that deer there, again, it needs it for lots of different things. It needs it to generate heat, for example. Okay, it needs it to. It's going to lose some by excretion when it poos and pees. Some will be lost in simply in movement as well. There's lots of ways in which this animal needs energy. Okay, only a small amount of energy is being used to actually grow and build up new tissue. So of the 10 joules being taken in here, only about then 1% can get passed on to the lion in this case then. So you can see pretty quickly then we're losing energy quite rapidly as we move up this food chain. Normally what happens in fact is we only really have food chains of maybe 3 or 4 organisms in length because there's so much energy being lost between each level of the food chain. So again, you might get questions about energy calculations. Now you'll do different examples of those in the past paper questions. You might be asked, for example, what percentage of energy can get passed on. If we think percentage wise, well, what percentage can get passed on then to the next one here? If it's taken in 10 joules, only one get passed on, so there's going to be then 1 divided by 10 multiplied by 100 can get passed on then. Okay, so only we're really saying here is only 10% can get passed on then. So again, you can have quite calculations like that then. Now, food chains are quite a simplistic way of describing what happens in nature. Normally, of course, it's not just one food chain. In a particular area, you might find in lots of food chains working together. So again, we have another simple one here. Now, there's a few important things when we plot these food webs. So food web simply is a combination of food chains which are put together here. Now, in terms of these food webs, what happens in fact then is the ones then on the bottom line. So if we kind of draw a line across here, those are the producers. Let's put a big P here. Those are the producers. The next one up, the next level up here, they're going to be the primary consumers. Okay, so basically they are the things then which eat the plants. So of course are herbivores. So we've got primary consumers here. Now then after that you have then what's the third level of the tertiary consumer. Okay, that's going to be in fact here is our tertiary consumer. And then we have at the very top we have then we call our quaternary consumer. Or simply we can simply call it top consumer. So this can be called top consumer here then. Now, you might be asked questions about food webs. One of the things you're asked about, for example, then is you might be asked then, what happens if one of the animals dies off? If we take an example like let's see here, let's kill off this dragonfly nymph. Okay. Now, if we kill off this dragonfly nymph, that means, of course, then the brown trout, well, they might decrease in number because they've got less dragonfly nymph to eat, and therefore they might get hungry, they might die off. Now, what also might happen though is if you kill off the dragonflies, then the brown trout then might eat more mayfly nymph, and it might eat then more of these freshwater shrimp. Now, freshwater shrimp are eaten by both of these two things then. Okay, so again, let's think for the most obvious things here. If we kill off a dragonfly nymph, well, the number of brown trout might decrease because there's less to eat. But certainly the mayfly nymph would also then decrease because the brown trout is eating it instead then now. So again, there's lots of things which can happen then with food webs. Try and be precise though. Make sure you say things such as the brown trout numbers would decrease because they've got less food to eat. So always be quite specific here. So we've mentioned food chains, we've mentioned food webs. Let's think of another area, okay? An area which if you've been filling in the notes, you're going to find is quite confusing in the notes here. So let's think of these food pyramids then. And really, there's two kinds of food pyramids. One is called then the pyramid of numbers, and one of those is called the pyramid of biomass. And look at both of these two things in turn then. Pyramid of numbers first of all then. If we think about food chain, okay, food chain of course shows simply what eats what. Okay, but now we have to think about then how many of each thing's been eaten here. So what we can do is we can start to plot then what's called a pyramid of numbers. So we have an example here. Here we have our pyramid numbers here. So we have, if we think have at the bottom here, we've got our producers. Okay, now simple food chain, of course, you go producer to snail to thrush to sparrowhawk. So we've just simply turned it to that side here then. Okay, now you're going to find that there'll be lots in of clover being eaten. So therefore, this big bar here represents then lots of clover. Snail, again, there's going to be some snails, not as many clover, not as many snails as there are clover, but certainly we've got the snails here. So again, we're going to have a smaller bar for the snails. Then thrush are going to be not going to be as many thrush eating the snails, so therefore it's going to decrease again. And then last of all, of course, we've got the sparrowhawk, which might only be one of these things at the top here then. So we have our permanent numbers here then. Now normally, really the bars wouldn't be quite as wide as that, but you kind of get the general idea here. Now there is a problem, however, with pyramidal numbers. Now sometimes we get an odd shaped pyramid. Okay, if we take an example of a tree. Now certainly lots of different animals can live on one tree. So it looks a bit like this then. So you kind of got one producer, you've got then lots then of primary consumers, and you've got then your secondary consumers. You can see quite clearly here it's not a pyramid shape anywhere. And so it's quite confusing, and therefore scientists quite often then what they'll do is they'll plot a different kind of pyramid, and they'll plot what's called a pyramid of biomass. Pyramid of biomass then is the total mass at each level. So if we think here's a massive oak tree, there's only one oak tree, but it has a very large mass then. Now, if it was, let's go back to a different example. If we go back to the previous example with the clover then would need to be then, you need to find the mass of all the clover. Okay, so get all the clover, find the mass of each individual clover, and then multiply the individual mass by the total number of clover. So you can see we've got then the total mass. So in this case here, the total mass of oak tree at the bottom of this pyramid of biomass. Then you've got the caterpillars. Again, you need in theory then to count all the caterpillars and also find the mass of one individual caterpillar. Then we've got the birds here. Sorry, we've got the birds here, and also we have, of course, you've got the fox in this case here at the top then. Now, pyramid biomass is normally in 99.99% of the time is this pyramid shape then. Okay, so again, it does kind of give a better idea as to where this energy is coming from if we use a pyramid of biomass. But there are some big disadvantages of a pyramid of biomass. One of the questions you get is asking you to compare the pyramid of biomass with the pyramid of numbers, and therefore you might need to know something like this then. So what it shows, well, we've mentioned before, the pyramid of numbers shows the number of organisms at each trophic level, each feeding level. Pyramid of biomass shows the total mass, so forget the individual mass multiplied by the number. So the total mass of organisms at each trophic level. Advantages of pyramid of biomass, it's quite easy. Okay, you can kind of count the number of grass quite easily. You can count maybe the number even of spiders quite easily. So again, we can then measure these things quite easily. Okay, but again, it doesn't allow for the fact that some things are much bigger than other things. Whereas a pyramid of biomass does take size into consideration then. Pyramid biomass is not a pyramid shape. Pyramid of numbers, sorry, isn't a pyramid shape, whereas pyramid of biomass is then a pyramid shape then. Only big problem with pyramid of biomass is now the amount of water in different organisms could be quite different. So for example, if you're measuring then the mass of grass on a dry sunny day, there wouldn't be as much water in the grass as there was then on a very wet day. So the water content can change quite a bit. So to allow for that, what happens in fact then is we need to dry out the different samples. Now we need to dry out the grass samples. We also need to dry out the animal samples. So therefore, to plot a pyramid of biomass accurately, you need to dry out the different animals. That means, of course, you need to kill the different animals. So therefore, then it's much harder to measure the pyramid of biomass. That's the difference between the two then. So we've mentioned so far food chains, we've mentioned food webs, we've mentioned then pyramid numbers and pyramid of biomass. Let's go on to something else. Okay, let's go on then now on to nutrients. So again, if we think here, one of the films, in fact, then which I'm watching at home at the minute actually is The Lion King, and in The Lion King then there is a famous song about the circle of life, and the whole idea of nutrient cycles is to do with the circle of life. Then, if we think here about anything which dies, of course, well, when it dies, it gets decomposed. Okay, that might be bacteria, it might be fungus, but it decomposes here. And what happens is that the actual nutrients built up in the decaying animal in this case here is being broken down, and those nutrients are being released back into the soil again. So that's what we mean by these kind of cycle of nutrients. Kind of starts off, gets built up as you move along the food chain, but as animals die, they get recycled again and put back into nature again then. Now, we said decomposers kind of carry out this final step then. Now, if we want decomposition to take place, they need to have heat, they need to have oxygen, they need to have water. Okay. There's a term there which we use in terms of decomposers called saprophytic nutrition. Again, it's kind of a hard word to spell, but this saprophytic nutrition is here then. Now, what does that really mean? Well, again, it kind of talks about then how then we can then decompose these different animals. Now, once they're decomposed, they'll form humus. But again, let's go back then to think more about this idea of saprophytic nutrition. So let's take the example of this these mushrooms then which are growing then on this algae. In fact, then basically what we have is we've got some kind of, these could be at the bottom here, we could have maybe leaves which have been falling off the trees, landed in the soil, the moss, and also then the fungus in this case, and also bacteria will start to break it down then. So what does it do? If we think about the actual mushroom here, what it does in fact then is this part here, at the bottom of this part here, what happens in fact is we have enzymes being released. What happens is enzymes then they start then to be released into here. And what happens in fact is it dissolves the leaves. And what it does in fact then it dissolves the leaves, and then what happens is the actual then dissolved food then gets sucked back up into it again then. Okay. So we're saying here that we are releasing enzymes. Enzymes then dissolve the food, and then they suck up the liquid food again then. So again, this is what happens. And again, we mentioned that forms humus. Humus is kind of organic material which makes the soil nice and nutritious for the plants to grow again then. So that's saprophytic nutrition. Now, we've mentioned nutrient cycles. Now, we really needed to think about two main ones, carbon cycle and also the nitrogen cycle. Carbon cycle is the easier of the two, so let's discuss it first of all then. So I'm going to show you a little diagram here which kind of shows then the carbon cycle. Now again, we know already a bit about the carbon cycle. We know, of course, that inside the air we've got then carbon. I believe she say carbon dioxide, really, I should say up here then. Okay, so again, we've got a big supply of carbon dioxide in the air. Now, if we think about things putting carbon dioxide into the air, well, certainly combustion, when you burn things we burn coal in your house, for example, or maybe burning coal in a power station, or even maybe when you're burning then petrol or diesel in the car, these are all fossil fuels, and when you burn all these things, what happens is they put carbon dioxide into the air. Also, animals, when they respire, putting carbon dioxide into the air. When things are being decomposed, they're also putting carbon dioxide into the air, and even plants, particularly during the night when they're respiring, they are putting then carbon dioxide into the air. Okay, don't forget, plants respire all day, every day, but at nighttime, there's more CO2 being given out than being taken in. So we're saying that combustion and also respiration, both putting carbon dioxide into the air. Now, the only thing taking carbon dioxide out of the air is, in fact, then photosynthesis. So the plants then are taking in then carbon dioxide for photosynthesis. They're using the carbon and the carbon dioxide then to build new tissues, whether building new carbohydrates, building new starch, for example, also being added to other substances to make protein. So again, the actual plant then will take in this carbon dioxide and use it then to make glucose and make starch and make cellulose, and basically use it to build things up then. And of course then the plants, whether it be a tree, whether it be the grass here, that carbon then has been taken into the animals when they eat the plants, and then of course the animals will use it to build up their own carbon inside the air. Some of the carbon, though, however, has been put back into the air during respiration then. So we have our carbon cycle. Again, it's a very important cycle. We know, of course, then that things can go wrong with this cycle. We really want to keep the amount of carbon dioxide in the air reasonably constant. Okay, at the minute then it's about 0.04% of the air is carbon dioxide. Now again, that doesn't sound that much, but again, it does have very serious consequences, particularly if we increase then the amount of carbon dioxide. Let's think first of all, though, about the importance of this carbon dioxide. So now we have, of course, around our Earth, we have then an atmosphere. Here's our atmosphere kind of around here then. That atmosphere is very, very important. If there wasn't an atmosphere there, what would happen in fact is the Earth would be too cold. So we need to have some of this gas in around the Earth then. Now, If we think about what happens and how this helps, well, here we have then some energy coming in from the sun. Okay, this radiation is coming from the sun. It comes through here. Some's going to in fact bounce straight off the atmosphere. Okay, but some is going to come into the Earth and start to heat up the Earth. Then now some of the heat will escape. Okay, but what happens in fact is some of the heat then gets kept in by the atmosphere. It gets kind of bounced back and forth inside the atmosphere here. Then the problem is, however, is that if we have too many greenhouse gases, too much carbon dioxide, for example, and methane is another big one. But too many of these gases here, what happens is the kind of layer you can think of it as getting thicker and thicker and thicker. And the thicker this layer gets, then the more heat gets trapped. The more heat gets trapped, of course, then the hotter the Earth actually becomes. So even a very small change in the amount of these greenhouse gases will have a very serious consequence then on the Earth. Then again, we all know a few pictures here to remind us here. Again, if we are burning lots of trees down, for example, chopping a lot of trees down, we're putting more carbon dioxide into the air. If that happens, then well, some areas will have a lot then of drought. Okay, the deserts in fact would get bigger. Okay, deserts get bigger. What happens in fact as well is we're going to have then a loss of habitat. Okay, here's an example of a polar bear. Maybe not quite as bad as this all the time, but we have a polar bear here. If those ice sheets are melting, of course he's not going to have as much place to live and to hunt. Okay, and also of course as they melt, then of course what also happens is the water levels would start to increase. That's going to go into problems with lots of low-lying areas where we've got lots of flooding taking place. Also lots of flooding and also lots of hurricanes or tornadoes, lots of extremes of weather as well. And so again, lots of problems will happen if global warming takes place and if we're not careful with the amount then of carbon dioxide we put into the air then. Now what can we do? How can we kind of reduce warming which takes place? Well, one of the big things is plant more trees. Now, the minute then across the world we are trying to plant more trees, particularly in Western countries, we are planting more trees. Donald Trump, for example, talked about how he wants to plant then 1 trillion more trees, and across the UK as well, we are trying to plant more and more trees. Why? Because the trees, of course, they take in carbon dioxide. So one thing is plant more trees. Obviously, the opposite thing of that is to not chop down as many trees. The minute, of course, across the world, we are chopping down lots and lots of trees every single year then. So we plant more trees, don't chop down as many trees, and also as well, try not to use as many fossil fuels. If we think here, then this is a coal-fired power station. As we're getting electricity from this station, of course, we're using up then lots of fossil fuels. If we can use other sources like hydroelectric power and tidal power, wind power, and even nuclear power, we're not using up as many fossil fuels, and therefore we're not producing as much carbon dioxide then. So you can try and use fewer fossil fuels. That could be as well be then we're using public transport rather than using cars all the time. We're using a bike, or maybe walking somewhere instead of actually then using your car. Then all different ways in which we can try and reduce the amount of CO2 going into the air. So that's kind of a bit about the carbon cycle. Now the trickier one though is the nitrogen. So here we have the nitrogen cycle. Now this is one of the most difficult things you'll study this year. It's also one of the things which pops up most in the exams. Now there are a few basic things to remember in the nitrogen cycle. First of all, we can say that we have in the air we've got the nitrogen gas. So we know that about 4/5 of the air is nitrogen. Now, even though the plants need nitrogen, and even though the animals need nitrogen, they can't take it in from the air. Nitrogen, in fact, is important to make proteins, and also important for making DNA. And they can't take it in from the air; they need to take it in a different form. Now, plants, first of all, they take it in the form of nitrates. So a lot of the nitrogen cycle is how we can convert the nitrogen gas in the air into nitrates in the soil. So let's have a look at some ways in which that's done then. So the most obvious way maybe is through then a bacteria called nitrogen fixing bacteria. Now if you put your hand in some soil, you're going to find inside there you've got lots of bacteria, and one of those kinds of bacteria is called nitrogen fixing bacteria. What does it do? Well, it actually takes nitrogen gas from the air and converts it into nitrates. Now some plants have an advantage, because what happens is they have then what we call root nodules. And those are kind of swellings around the roots of these plants then, which contain lots of this nitrogen fixing bacteria. And what happens then is that the bacteria, it gains nutrients from the plants, but also the plants gain nitrates from those bacteria. So you're both kind of working hand in hand in that case. So nitrogen fixing bacteria is one of the ways in which it happens. Another way then it happens in naturally is by lightning. Now if we think here, lightning is so hot and so much energy that it actually causes the nitrogen and the oxygen to combine, and we can form nitrates during that process. Also then we have fertilizer. Now of course farmers and gardeners put fertilizer on their crops and on their soil to add more substances to it, and one of those substances then is nitrates. And we'll come back to fertilizers later on in this chapter though. But fertilizer is another way in which we can get nitrates into the soil. So there's three ways in which we're putting nitrates into the soil. The plants will absorb the nitrates through the roots. Now that happens by a process called active transport, also called active uptake. So that we're saying that nitrates get absorbed into the plants, and those nitrates will get converted into plant protein. So we've got these nitrogen containing compounds have been created then by the plant. Then of course then animals eat the plants, and that gets converted into animal protein. So they can now contain substances which contain nitrogen. Now when those plants die, or when the animals die, or even when the actual animals pass out feces and urine, what happens is all these substances, they all contain then nitrogen. The first thing which happens, in fact, is that the substances are decomposed. That normally involves then bacteria and fungi. Now then we have a different kind of bacteria, the nitrifying bacteria, which then converts the ammonia, which is in the dead plants and animals and waste. So the ammonia or the ammonium compounds are converted by the nitrifying bacteria into more nitrates. So we've said then so far we've got nitrogen fixing bacteria being involved. We now then have nitrifying bacteria being involved as well here. Now the farmer wants to have as much nitrate in the soil as possible. What he doesn't want is he doesn't want to lose any nitrates. But unfortunately there are bacteria in the soil which does remove the nitrates and put it back into the air. And that bacteria is called denitrifying bacteria. Now again, farmers don't want these to grow. Unfortunately these grow in different conditions. If the soil, for example, does not have much oxygen in it. So for example, it might be maybe that there's been a lot of rain, and the rain has filled up the spaces between the soil, and there's very little oxygen in the soil. Now there's problems with that. One, if there's not enough oxygen, the plants in fact then can't absorb the nitrates as easily. But also the nitrifying bacteria, this denitrifying bacteria, this then will increase in number and will be more active. And what they will do is they're going to take the nitrates out of the soil and put it back into the air again. Okay. Again, we don't want that to happen, but that is something which happens then. So there's different processes involved in the nitrogen cycle. And again, there's three different kinds of bacteria: nitrogen fixing bacteria, nitrifying bacteria, and denitrifying bacteria. Now your questions in exams will assume your knowledge and will test your knowledge then of these three kinds of bacteria. So that's kind of again what we mean by these then. So we said first of all we've got nitrogen fixing bacteria. Now it's the one which converts nitrogen gas to ammonia. We have then nitrifying bacteria. It converts ammonium from dead plants and animals and from waste into nitrates. The one we don't want then, the denitrifying bacteria, converts nitrates back into nitrogen gas. So again, we don't want that to happen. And there's my little sad face for that then. So that is the nitrogen cycle. Now one of the things I also mentioned in there is I mentioned that the plants take in then the nitrates in. They take it in through cells called. And another question which pops up quite often then is how are these root hair cells adapted then for the absorption of different substances? It's quite clear they have these big long extensions. And these big long extensions greatly increases the surface area. So we can say there is a long extension. Sometimes we say a finger-like extension, which increases the surface area, and therefore we can absorb more nitrates. Now, nitrates are absorbed, as I said before, by a process called active uptake, or else also called active transport. So if we look at what happens, I also say then that for this process to take place, there needs to be oxygen present. Now, if we think here, say we've got some nitrates in the soil. Okay, so that's going to put a small n to represent my nitrates. What happens then is those nitrates then will need to get absorbed into the plant via these root hair cells. We need to go from where there's a small amount outside to where there's lots inside. Okay, I'm going to indicate that with a big N. So there's less outside than there is inside. Now, normally when things diffuse, it always goes from where there's lots of a substance to where there's less of a substance. So this idea of active transport or active uptake is going in the opposite direction. It's going from where there's less of a substance to where there's more of a substance. And that process requires energy. Now, any time that energy is required, of course, we need to have respiration requiring. If respiration is to require, then of course we need oxygen as well here. So basically, if the soil becomes waterlogged, then there's not enough oxygen in between the soil particles, and therefore this process will not take place then. So we're saying root hair cells, what does it do? They need oxygen for respiration, so they can carry out active transport. And active transport is a movement of substances from a low concentration to a high concentration against their concentration gradient. So, looking at fertilizers. Now we said, of course, the farmers will put fertilizer under the field then so as the plants will grow better. Now specifically, there's different kinds of fertilizers, and there's different substances in fertilizers which the plant needs. Now one of those then in terms of fertilizers is going to be the nitrates. Of course, we've mentioned nitrates. They're used to make proteins. Of course, proteins are used to make growth. Now other things they need, well, we also then have in there, we also have calcium. Okay, now calcium is required in fact to make cell walls. Now we know cell walls are made of cellulose, and cellulose in fact is made of glucose. Now the cell wall though, cell wall has lots of those cellulose strands, and the cellulose strands are kind of glued together by calcium. So again, we've got then this calcium which helps us strengthen these cell walls then. Another one we have then is we also then have magnesium. Magnesium is required to make chlorophyll, and of course without chlorophyll we can't have photosynthesis taking place. So again, this is something else which pops up in terms of the exams. Now one of the last things, okay, if we put on too much fertilizer or too much slurry, okay, which of course is natural fertilizer, if we put on too much of this, we can have a very serious problem here. We can get a problem called eutrophication. And eutrophication is something which also pops up in terms of exams, and it could be maybe a 5-mark question in exams. It's kind of talking about how this increase in fertilizer causes the death of fish in the water. Again, so that's a 5-mark question. Let's see how we can explain it. Well, here's the first thing. Here we have a farmer, and the farmer then is spraying his slurry then onto the field. Okay, at the minute outside my house, there's slurry being sprayed recently. Not very nice smell, but we have this slurry then. Okay, and obviously it's useful for the farmers because it helps the plants to grow. Now, if it gets very wet, okay, if it rains heavily, for example, some of that slurry, some of that fertilizer will wash off into any neighboring streams and lakes. Even what will happen, in fact, is the fertilizer will dissolve in the water, might then pass through into the soil, into the water table beneath the soil, and eventually gets into rivers and streams. Now, there's a word we use here called runoff. And runoff is an important word. It's a word the examiners look for then. And this is where the fertilizer is sitting on the surface, dissolves in the water, and then runs off into rivers and streams. So again, it's a word we want to use. Now, as it goes into the rivers and streams, of course, it adds then different substances into the rivers and streams, like nitrogen and phosphate. Now, what happens is it goes on into the river. What happens, in fact, is it starts to build up then in the water. Okay, and what it does, in fact, then is it causes then it causes then a lot then of green material, in this case here algae, to grow on the surface, and that's called algal bloom. Now, because this is now covering the surface, that means that the light then cannot get then beneath the algae, and therefore then any plants beneath then the algae cannot get then any sunlight. Now, if they can't get any sunlight, then of course they cannot photosynthesize. If they cannot photosynthesize, what happens in fact then is that they will start then to die. Now, if they die, then what happens is bacteria comes in, lots of bacteria comes in and reproduces quickly, and what happens is that bacteria starts to decompose then the plants. Now, as the bacteria decompose these plants, then of course they're using up oxygen. If the oxygen levels, if they start to decrease, then of course then what happens is if there isn't enough oxygen in the water, then all of the animals in the water will start to die off then. Okay, and that's what caused the death of these things. So farmers have certain times when they should and should not be putting fertilizer on the field. Certainly they want to avoid any time when there's a lot of rain forecast then. So that's eutrophication. Now, that's one way in which we, of course, we are killing off plants in the water and also killing off then animals in the water. And that, of course, is reducing the biodiversity of the water. What else affects biodiversity? Well, again, there's a few obvious examples. If we chop down lots of trees, then of course we are chopping down lots of habitats. So all the animals which live inside the trees, of course, they are losing their habitats and therefore they're beginning to die off. And that's certainly one of the biggest problems we have on Earth is humans then destroying lots of habitats. Now, other things we have as well, of course, we're burning more fossil fuels than ever before. All of the appliances we have at home all require electricity, and therefore we need to burn lots of fossil fuels to get electricity. Now, still we'd like to be moving away from burning fossil fuels, but still at the minute then across the world, most of the electricity comes from burning fossil fuels. Now, other forms of pollution as well, whether it be water pollution, whether it be air pollution, there's lots of other things which we're doing to kill off the plants and animals through pollution. And then of course as well, we mentioned already, using excess fertilizers would be a problem as well here. What can we do to try and increase biodiversity? Well, again, a few other obvious examples. We can plant more trees. Okay, we plant more trees, or else we can use sustainable woodlands, where somebody then, the people then will monitor quite closely then when to chop down different trees. What they might do is they have times and maybe with a might chop down a small amount of the big trees, let the small trees then grow up, keep planting new trees, and therefore what happens in fact then is we are removing some of the bigger trees, but we're allowing the smaller trees to grow, and therefore we are almost like recycling the trees then. So we have what we call sustainable forests or sustainable woodlands. Another example, of course, is to plant more trees. We know Donald Trump is certainly not reducing the amount of carbon dioxide going into the air by very much, but what his idea is he wants to plant then 1 trillion trees to try then and offset the amount of carbon dioxide that America is putting into the air. What else can we do? Of course, we can then avoid using fossil fuels as much. So maybe that could be using public transport rather than cars all the time, maybe cycling to work rather than using our car. And also there's other initiatives which have been set up globally. Kyoto Protocol, for example, and there was initiatives set up in Paris 2015, for example. And these are when countries get together and they decide then that they want to try and reduce then the amount of carbon dioxide they're putting into the air and try and reduce the increase in the Earth's temperature. That's when kind of countries get together then. So that's a bit about ecology and what we need to know about ecology then. So year 11, what should you do next? Well, first thing is to attempt to fill in the ecological relationships handout. Now I say attempt because it is quite difficult to fill that one in without too much help in class. A few things already has popped up. The pyramid of numbers and pyramid of biomass page is slightly wrong. The top one you can plot the pyramid of numbers, just leave out the kilojoules part, but just plot the pyramid of numbers at the top. At the bottom, pyramid of biomass. Probably the easiest way to fix that is simply, instead of plotting a pyramid of biomass at the bottom of that page, is to fill this to do another pyramid of numbers graph at the bottom. But again, there are some parts of that which are easy to fill in. If you have a go and you can't fill in some parts, leave out those parts. We'll get those filled in when we get back to school. But there are certainly lots of parts you can't fill in. For example, the cycle diagrams near the back, certainly those are quite easy to fill in then. So do please attempt to fill in those handouts. Now what we'll also do then is you should have the past paper questions. What I'll do is I'll put those past paper questions online as well in Google Classroom, just in case you don't have those. Do those questions, and what you can do then is you can then send those questions back to me via Google Classroom so they can mark them. Now after that, what I can also do then is I'll put the mark scheme on just so as you know where you went wrong in terms of those questions.